Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're going to be checking out Intel's flagship mobile processor in their 10th generation lineup, the Core i9-10980HK. This is the third CPU we've looked at in the Comet Lake H series, after the Core i7-10875H and Core i7-10750H. So we're starting to get a pretty comprehensive outline of where Intel is positioned in the market right now. This Core i9 part we're looking at in this review is typically found in the most expensive laptops you can get, but it also promises to be the fastest. So a quick recap of what Intel's offering this generation with Comet Lake H. In this lineup, there's only one Core i9 processor, the 10980HK, and it brings with it 8 cores, 16 threads, and Intel's standard 45-watt default TDP. There's also 16 megabytes of level 3 cache, DDR4 2933 memory support, and it comes unlocked, meaning you can adjust the multiplier table and other values provided your OEM gives you that functionality. In terms of clock speeds, like all 10th gen parts, it's a bit of a mess here. The base clock is straightforward at 2.4 GHz, but the turbo speeds are all over the place. The maximum this CPU will do on a single core is 5.3 GHz, but that's only with Intel Thermal Velocity Boost, which means the CPU needs to be running lower than 65 degrees Celsius to achieve that clock. This turbo clock drops to 5.1 GHz when running above 85C, and drops further to 4.4 GHz under an all-core load. And of course, due to power limits in mobile form factors, none of these clock speeds are attainable under a sustained workload. The reason we only have one Core i9 processor in the lineup this year is due to Intel introducing an 8-core CPU into the Core i7 series in the Core i7-10875H. Aside from being unlocked, the only difference between the 10875H and 10980HK is in clock speeds, with a 100 MHz higher base and 200 MHz higher boost clocks. But again, as these clocks don't really tell us how the CPU runs under a sustained workload, the true difference between these parts is a bit of a mystery on paper, so we'll unravel that mystery today. We're also going to get a great look at the full capabilities of where Intel's 14nm process technology currently stands for mobile CPUs, because the 10980HK is meant to be the best of the best in terms of silicon and performance. How it stacks up against AMD's 7nm chips, in particular the 8-core Ryzen 7 4800H, is going to be very interesting. For today's testing, we're using MSI's brand new GE66 Raider in its top tier CPU and GPU configuration. So we have the Core i9-10980HK inside, as well as NVIDIA's GeForce RTX 2080 Super Max-Q GPU. There's also 16 GB of dual-channel DDR4 memory, a 1080p 300Hz display, and a rather sizable 99.9 watt-hour battery. I've got to say, while I generally prefer the slimmer designs of, say, MSI's GS66, the GE66 chassis is much nicer than I expected, with a premium metal construction and this interesting RGB LED light bar along the front edge. The GE66 doesn't go all out for thinness, so there's a bit of heft to this laptop, but that's all to fit in the cooling solution that can handle Core i9 and RTX 2080 Super GPUs. And it's not even close to being as ridiculous as those chunky beasts like the GT76. Great display, great keyboard, yeah, the GE66 did surprise me. What we'll be showing you today are two power configurations throughout this review. One is the stock baseline settings for the Core i9-10980HK, which means a 45-watt long-term PL1 power limit. The GE66 doesn't run by default at this power limit, but it should represent how the Core i9 CPU performs in slim and light 15-inch productivity laptops, say a Dell XPS 15. Not saying the XPS 15 is definitely configured like that, we haven't tested it yet, but those sorts of systems are more likely to be configured at 45 watts. The other configuration is the maximum the GE66 provides, which is a 75 watt PL1 limit. So this is more along the lines of the best case and what you'll typically see from beefier gaming notebooks. In both configurations, we've left the boost states untouched, and with this system that topped out at around 115 watts PL2 for a few seconds. And it's important to note the PL2 limit, or observed boost power limits, because this is how Intel is able to hit their rated boost clock speeds. It takes 115 watts for this Core i9 to run at around 4.2 GHz all-core, while I rarely, if ever, saw the CPU hit 5.1 GHz. In Cinebench i20 single thread, for example, 4.8 GHz and around 30 watts of power usage was pretty common. In the following benchmark charts, you'll see various CPUs listed. These are an average of results using that processor configuration in different laptops. The full list of laptops is in the description. We try our best to make these comparisons as apples to apples as possible, so that means removing thermal bottlenecks if we can, and running with the same 16GB dual channel memory configuration. We also test with default TDP limits unless otherwise specified. Alright, let's kick this benchmark session off with Cinebench R20. What's very interesting straight off the bat is how the Core i9-10980HK performs relative to the Core i7-10875H. Despite both being 45-watt 8-core processors, the Core i9 CPU is actually quite a bit faster. We're looking at a 20% performance advantage here after an average of 3 runs. Part of this is due to a higher boost power limit, 115 watts versus 80 watts, but the rest is down to the Core i9 part just simply clocking higher overall. This points to the Core i9 CPU being a better binned part, but we'll explore that a bit later on. We also see the 10980HK matching the performance of the 10875H when configured at around 62 watts in our Gigabyte Aorus 15G test system. So again, that's a decent efficiency improvement. We also are a good 30% faster than the Core i7-10750H within the same 45 watt envelope. However, we are 20% slower than the Ryzen 7 4800H. And even when we push the 10980HK up to 75 watts of sustained power draw, it still can't outperform the Ryzen 7 4800H, ending up around 5% behind in this workload. Single thread performance is also around par with the 4800H and below that of our 10875H laptop, which bizarrely was able to clock a bit higher on a single core than our Core i9 system. I don't expect this will be the case for every Core i9 laptop, but it was consistently true for this MSI machine. Cinebench R15 shows the same results. The Core i9-10980HK is the fastest Intel 14nm laptop CPU we've tested, but in multi-core workloads it just isn't fast enough to keep up with the Ryzen processors, although it does beat Ryzen for single-thread speed. Handbrake is one of the most important benchmarks we run on productivity-focused laptops because it's a long production test. After you finish your work, this is something you hit the go button on and make a sandwich. Those that want to slam down a sandwich and get right back to work quickly should choose a Ryzen processor because the Ryzen 7 4800H was 20% faster than the Core i9-10980HK in this test, shaving off around 7 minutes of encode time. However, you won't be wasting too much company time on your sandwich break with the Core i9-10980HK because it still ended up 11% faster than the Core i7-10875H and 25% faster than the Core i7-10750H. Increasing the 10980HK to 75 watts does get it closer to what AMD is providing with Ryzen, but it doesn't fully match the performance on offer. Blender is another important multi-core productivity benchmark, and here once again we see the Core i9-10980HK delivering a decent 14% performance gain over the i7-10875H at the same power limit. And increasing the power limit from 45 watts to 75 watts in Blender provides the largest improvement we saw in our test suite with a 20% gain. However, Ryzen still holds the overall performance crown here with the 4800H. Intel just can't match AMD's 7nm tech with 14nm within reasonable limits. XL is typically a strong workload for Intel processors, and that's no exception here. While the Core i7-10875H is in the ballpark of AMD's Ryzen 7 processor, the Core i9-10980HK is able to take a performance lead of around 10% when performing calculations with a large spreadsheet. This is largely down to increased all-core clocks, given this workload takes only a handful of seconds to complete. On the other hand, there's not much difference between the 10980HK, 10875H, and Ryzen 7 4800H in PC Mark X's productivity test, which looks at lighter productivity performance. The 10980HK does end up 9% faster than the 10750H, but with performance practically equal at the top end, if you just use your notebook for light document work, there's no reason to spend big on a Core i9. Essentials performance, which measures app loading and those sorts of lighter tasks, is also reasonably close between most of the high-end processors. The 10980HK is able to achieve modest single-digit performance gains over the 10875H in 7-zip, with a larger gain seen in decompression. Like we've seen from other 8-core Intel CPUs, the 10980HK is faster than Ryzen in compression, but slower in decompression. MATLAB is another benchmark that largely runs in the processor's all-core boost state, so gains over the 10875H are more limited than with sustained performance. We're seeing a 5% difference here, although this increases to 15% over the 10750H. Comparing Intel to AMD, performance is roughly equivalent between the 10980HK and 4800H here, with a slight advantage to Intel. Everyone's favourite single-threaded workload is Acrobat PDF exporting, one of the strongest results for Intel processors. As my 10980HK system can't clock quite as high as the 10875H, it does fall somewhat behind in this test. However, Intel does hold a double-digit gain over Ryzen in this workload regardless. AES crypto performance is unchanged compared to other Intel 10th gen processors, as this workload is hardware accelerated. AMD's AES block is faster than Intel's, so leads to better encryption performance in this test. For code compilation, first up we have GCC compile, which is the more single-threaded of our tests, although it does hit multiple cores at times. Here the 10980HK is around 15 to 20% faster than Core i7 processors, but still 8% behind AMD's Ryzen 7 4800H. This gap to Ryzen narrows with the heavily multi-threaded Chromium compile, but only marginally. AMD is still faster here. I'm going to round out this review with a brief look at some of our compute-heavy productivity workloads, which are influenced to some extent by the GPU. Given this MSI GE66 includes a powerful RTX 2080 Supermax Q, there are some tests where this component is more influential than the CPU, but the results may be useful to some people regardless. First up is Adobe Photoshop using the Puget workload, and this is a mostly CPU limited benchmark once you reach mid-level tier discrete graphics. There's no real performance difference on offer here between the Core i9-10980HK and the Core i7 10875H. Both outperform the Ryzen 7 4800H by 10%. This makes one of Intel's 8-core parts a great choice for those who primarily use Photoshop. DaVinci Resolve makes heavy use of the GPU, so choosing a laptop with a strong discrete GPU is the best course of action for Resolve editors. Core i9 laptops are often paired with high-end GPUs, which is why it's no surprise to see the pairing of the 10980HK with the RTX 2080 Super take it to the top of the charts. With Adobe Premiere performance, there are multiple tales to tell, with the latest version, 14.2.0, introducing GPU accelerated encoding for NVIDIA and AMD GPUs. Many aspects to exporting have become more GPU demanding. This is why we see, like with Resolve, higher tier GPUs performing well in this workload. With that in mind, the Core i9 configuration finishes high. However, editing performance is largely equivalent between the Ryzen and Core i9 configurations, as seen in Puget's live playback test. In fact, when using effects such as the warp stabilizer, you're actually better off with an AMD Ryzen processor, which comes out double-digit percentages ahead. You also get better performance, or in the worst cases, equal performance, with Ryzen when exporting using a 2-pass encode, which is not GPU accelerated outside of standard effects. Before showing some performance summaries, I also wanted to show clock speeds for the Core i9 10980HK and Core i7 10875H in Handbrake to show how Intel's superior binning for the Core i9 part allows for greater sustained performance within the same power limit. At 45 watts, the 10875H generally ran around 2.8 GHz long-term in our benchmark, whereas the 10980HK was comfortably pushing 3.1 GHz in this same workload. This 300 MHz clock speed difference is why the Core i9 CPU finished the encode 10% faster. Naturally, this can be improved through increasing power limits, undervolting and overclocking, which are all possible on this unlocked K-series part, depending on whether your OEM allows it and whether there's enough thermal headroom. But with stock settings and the same power limit, I did find the Core i9 part to have better silicon, so there is a difference here between the SKUs. Let's look at some performance breakdowns now. As I was just talking about, the Core i9 10980HK is generally faster than the Core i7 10875H. I saw up to 20% performance gains in multi-thread workloads, although for the most part, around a 5 to 10% difference is more realistic. Not all of this is from increased power consumption in the burst state, the chip is also better binned. This better binning allows the 10980HK to perform around the mark of the Core i7 10875H when the power limit is increased to 62 watts. So the baseline performance from this Core i9 should be around the mark of a mid to upper tier 10875H configuration. Intel's flagship 10th gen processor is also substantially faster than the Core i7 10750H under the same 45 watt limit. The upgrade to 8 cores delivers up to 35% better multi-core performance with an average performance gain near 20%. In a task like Handbrake, the 10980HK is almost able to match the clock speeds of the 10750H, but with 2 extra cores at hand, which leads to this performance delta. The 10980HK is generally going to be found in laptop chassis that use a power configuration above 45 watts. When increasing the power limit to the maximum MSI allowed using their built-in utilities with the GE66, which is approximately 75 watts, we saw up to a 20% gain in sustained multi-core workloads. This further separates the Core i9 part from Core i7s, although what exact power configurations you're comparing is going to be pretty important. While the 10980HK is the fastest 14nm mobile CPU yet, it's quite easily beaten by AMD's 7nm Ryzen 7 4800H in most multi-thread tests. At 45 watts, the Core i9 processor is around 20% slower, but it does deliver better single-thread performance and better cache-limited performance. Whether Ryzen or Intel is better for you will depend on the workloads you are running. Even at 75 watts, the Core i9 10980HK is unable to beat the Ryzen 7 4800H across the board, still falling up to 13% behind in multi-core workloads. However, generally speaking, this configuration gets pretty close, and even higher power configurations, such as 90 watts or 100 watts if possible, should beat the stock Ryzen 7 4800H at the cost of heat and power. Like many other investigations into Intel's 10th gen processors, my overall thoughts are a bit mixed. Starting with the positive stuff, I was surprised by how much better binned this Core i9 10980HK is compared to the Core i7 10875H. I was expecting both to deliver similar long-term performance of 45 watts, with the benefit of the Core i9 mostly coming down to higher power limits, but that's not the case. The 10980HK is able to clock higher within the same TDP, leading to a modest gain depending on the test. This makes the 10980HK the fastest Intel mobile CPU available right now, and not totally pointless compared to the cheaper 10875H. With the raised power limit, and only with the raised power limit, the 10980HK is also a decent choice for a productivity-focused laptop as it gets pretty close to AMD's Ryzen 7 4800H in multi-core tests while outperforming it in single-core. Yes, it's a lot less efficient, it's totally incapable of this performance on battery, and it needs a better cooling solution to handle the increased power, but buyers of a power limit raised Core i9 laptop shouldn't feel like they are getting something significantly inferior to AMD's mid-range laptop APU. I couldn't say the same for any of the other 10th gen parts, which are beaten by Ryzen even with reasonably high power limits. This is especially true when you factor in that most Core i9 laptops, especially those that will run at higher power limits, will come with a powerful discrete GPU like an RTX 2070 or higher. Given AMD laptops are currently unavailable with higher tier GPUs, this makes Intel the default choice for a high-performance DaVinci Resolve system, as an example. While the Core i9 10980HK isn't a bad processor, it's also not particularly amazing. The fact that it takes a substantial power increase to match AMD's Ryzen 7 4800H makes it unsuitable, in my opinion, for thinner, lighter laptops like you might see from a Dell XPS 15 type ultra portable. Yeah, the Core i9 is fine in the MSI GE66 that can run it at 75 watts and pair it with an RTX 2080 Super, but if it's limited to just 45 watts in a 17mm thick chassis, that system would be much faster with the Ryzen APU. And that's where Intel is really stuck right now with 14nm. They've needed to push out new Core i9s with their best bin silicon ever and increase the power limits well beyond what some laptops can do to just match AMD's stock standard 7nm APU performance for productivity. And they're only really able to do this with one processor, the highest tier one they have, which costs OEMs a fortune to use. And this brings me to the other major downside of the Core i9 10980HK, and that's the price. OEMs exclusively use Core i9 CPUs in high-end laptops, so the starting price for a 10980HK laptop is going to be well above $2,000 US. And that's exactly what we see right now, with the cheapest system setting you back $2,500 on Newegg. Granted, that does get you an RTX 2070 Super Max-Q GPU, which itself is reasonably capable, but yeah, that's a pretty high entry price. The GE66 I tested in this video will set you back $3,000, for example. With AMD offering the same or better multi-core performance in laptops starting at $1,000, that puts the pressure on Intel from another angle. Now, if you're fine with an RTX 2060 GPU, or you don't need anything faster for your production workload, say it is CPU limited, it doesn't make much sense to spend more than twice as much on a system that delivers mostly equal or inferior performance. And I haven't even talked about gaming here because really the Core i9 doesn't make much sense for gaming either. With laptop class GPUs, a Core i7-10750H is going to be fine with a higher tier GPU like an RTX 2070 Super. There's very little incentive to spend more on a Core i9 processor purely for gaming, especially when the price difference is several $100s. So really this leaves the Core i9-10980HK servicing a niche. Those after great productivity performance can get it at a much lower price with an AMD Ryzen 7 APU. Those who want a high-end gaming laptop not currently serviced by AMD systems can do so again at a lower price with a Core i7-10750H laptop. This leaves the Core i9 as the best choice for those that want both top-end gaming and top-end productivity performance at the same time, or top-end productivity in apps that make heavy use of the GPU. And that's not even talking about whether a desktop PC better serves those sorts of buyers. So yeah, pretty mixed thoughts on the Core i9-10980HK. The MSI GE66 is a great laptop. I actually think MSI has done a really nice job with this chassis and it delivers great performance, but it's not exactly a great value option, at least in this configuration, and I think that's where Intel laptops in general are suffering this generation. So that's it for this investigation into the Core i9-10980HK. There is still one more Intel 10th gen laptop processor that I'm interested in testing out. That's the quad-core Core i5 model. Might be pretty difficult to get that part based on how difficult it's been in the past to get the Core i5s, but yeah, we'll see whether we can get one of those in the coming weeks. We've also got plenty more laptop content coming up soon. We are very shortly going to be testing the AMD U-Series processors, so it's definitely worth subscribing for all that stuff. As always, we have our Patreon page, links are in the description below if you are interested in joining up and yeah, supporting the channel, getting access to stuff like Discord, monthly live streams, behind the scenes videos, and all that sort of thing. We really appreciate all the support we get from you guys. And that's it. I'll catch you in the next one.